Before anything breaks, before any world collapses under its own contradictions, there is always a structure that appears stable, a city that believes in its own permanence, a system that assumes its rules are universal, a moral architecture that does not yet recognize its own fragility. In the vast cosmology of Darkseid, this illusion of stability is not merely a narrative backdrop. It is the necessary precondition for something far more unsettling to emerge. The worlds that orbit the presence of Darkseid are not naive. They are advanced, mythologically dense, often populated by beings who understand power in ways that transcend ordinary human frameworks. They have seen gods rise and fall. They have witnessed empires stretch across galaxies and collapse into dust. And yet, even within this context, there persists a quiet assumption that evil is something that can be fought, something that can be resisted, something that can be defeated. This assumption is not questioned, not at first, because most narratives train perception in a specific way. Evil appears as action, as choice, as deviation from a moral norm. A villain does something, a hero responds. The conflict unfolds within a system that still believes in correction, in restoration, in the idea that imbalance can be addressed through force, sacrifice, or endurance. This is the architecture of almost every story that precedes the arrival of Darkseid. But Darkseid does not enter this architecture as a participant. He does not argue with it. He does not challenge it through rhetoric or ideology. He does not seek to corrupt it from within in the way more familiar antagonists might. His presence does something far more destabilizing. It renders the entire framework insufficient, not because he destroys it directly, but because he exists in a way that makes its assumptions irrelevant. There is a difference between a tyrant and a condition. A tyrant governs through power, through enforcement, through visible mechanisms of control. A tyrant can be resisted, overthrown, replaced. Even if the cost is catastrophic, the possibility of change remains embedded within the system. The existence of a tyrant still implies a world in which power is negotiable, even if unevenly distributed. Darkseid is not negotiable. He is not a ruler in the conventional sense, even though he sits upon a throne, commands armies, and governs a planet that functions as a monument to absolute domination. These are surface manifestations. They are symbols, visible structures that attempt to give form to something that is, at its core, not dependent on them. Because Darkseid does not represent power within a system. He represents the collapse of the system into power. This distinction is subtle, but it is absolute. In the presence of Darkseid, the idea that evil is a deviation begins to erode. What emerges instead is the suggestion that evil may not be an exception at all, that it may not require justification, motive, or psychological explanation, that it may exist as a fundamental property of reality, as intrinsic as gravity, as inevitable as time. This is where the phrase begins to take shape, not as a slogan, not as a declaration of identity, but as a structural revelation. Darkseid is. There is no verb that follows, no action that completes the sentence, no explanation that contextualizes it. The phrase does not describe what Darkseid does. It describes what he is, and in doing so, it shifts the entire framework through which conflict is understood. Because if evil is something that is, rather than something that happens, then resistance itself changes meaning. The heroes who encounter Darkseid do not face a villain in the traditional sense. They face a condition that does not depend on their existence. Their actions do not provoke him. Their resistance does not threaten him. Their victories, when they occur, do not alter his nature. They do not resolve the conflict. They interrupt it, temporarily. This is why Darkseid cannot be defeated in any final sense. Not because he is too powerful, although he is. Not because he is too intelligent, although he often is. But because the structure of the narrative does not allow for his elimination without collapsing the very idea of conflict that defines the world around him. To defeat Darkseid would be to prove that evil is contingent, and the universe he inhabits does not operate under that assumption. Instead, it operates under something far more unsettling. The idea that domination is not merely a strategy or a desire, but a principle. That control is not simply exercised, but embedded. That the impulse to reduce all things into submission is not an aberration, but a baseline condition waiting to be realized. Apocalypse, the world Darkseid governs, is not just a planet. It is a spatial metaphor for this condition. A landscape where every structure reflects hierarchy, where every interaction reinforces subjugation, where the environment itself seems to press downward, as if gravity has been intensified to the point of psychological suffocation. There is no illusion of freedom there, no pretense of moral balance. The system does not hide what it is. It does not justify itself. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it embodies. Total control. And yet, the true reach of Darkseid extends far beyond Apocalypse, because the threat he represents is not confined to territory. It is not limited by distance, by dimension, or by the physical constraints that typically define power. His influence operates through a different mechanism, one that does not require direct presence. He does not need to occupy a world to dominate it. He needs only to be understood, or perhaps more precisely, to be recognized. Because once the idea of Darkseid is internalized, once the possibility that evil is not an exception but a constant begins to take hold, something shifts within the observer. The conflict is no longer external. It is no longer a battle between forces that can be clearly separated into opposing sides. It becomes structural. It becomes a question of whether resistance itself is meaningful in a reality where domination is not imposed from outside, but emerges from the same conditions that produce order, identity, and existence itself. This is the insidious nature of Darkseid. He does not simply threaten the body. He threatens the framework through which meaning is constructed. He does not destroy hope in a dramatic or visible way. He erodes it by making its premises uncertain, by introducing the possibility that what is being resisted is not an enemy, but a law. And laws are not defeated. They are endured, or they are broken at a cost that reshapes the entire system in which they operate. This is why the presence of Darkseid carries a different kind of weight than other antagonistic forces. It is not just the scale of his power, although that scale is immense. It is the way in which his existence reframes every other conflict around him. He does not escalate tension. He redefines it, and in doing so, he transforms the narrative space from an arena of struggle into something closer to a pressure field. A condition in which every action, every resistance, every attempt at preservation is already operating within constraints that cannot be removed, only navigated. This is where the opening tension resides, not in a battle that is yet to begin, but in a realization that has not yet fully surfaced. The sense that the world, as it understands itself, may not be structured in the way it assumes, that the moral distinctions it relies on may not hold under sufficient pressure, that evil, in its most complete form, does not need to act. It only needs to be. And once that possibility enters the system, it cannot be removed. It can only be faced. Long before the phrase takes hold, before the idea of inevitability begins to shape perception, there is a genealogy of power that gives form to what will eventually be recognized as Darkseid. Not a childhood in any human sense, not a developmental arc driven by trauma or desire, but a sequence of transformations that slowly strip away contingency. What remains is not a personality. It is a consolidation. The figure that would become Darkseid begins not as an embodiment, but as a participant within a structure that still allows for movement, for rivalry, for ascension. The world of the new gods is not static. It is already a field of competing forces, a terrain defined by hierarchy, succession, and the constant negotiation of dominance. In this environment, power is not abstract. It is visible, contested, and deeply tied to position. Yet even here, something is different. While others seek power as a means, as a path toward recognition or preservation, Darkseid moves toward it as an end in itself. Not out of ambition in the conventional sense, but out of a kind of gravitational pull. There is no sense that he desires to rule in order to achieve something beyond rule. The structure itself becomes the objective. Control is not a tool. It is the destination. This orientation begins to reshape the field around him. Where other figures operate within the implicit rules of succession and legitimacy, Darkseid approaches those rules as provisional, temporary, useful only insofar as they facilitate his movement toward consolidation. The overthrow of existing order is not framed as rebellion. It is framed as correction, a realignment of reality toward a state that more accurately reflects its underlying condition. In this sense, his rise is not chaotic. It is precise. Every act of violence, every displacement of authority, every restructuring of hierarchy occurs with a kind of inevitability that makes resistance appear reactive rather than oppositional. Those who stand against him are not presented as equal forces in conflict. They are presented as remnants, as fragments of a system that has not yet caught up to its own logic. This is where the first fracture appears. Because within the world that produces Darkseid, there exists another principle, one that does not seek to dominate but to sustain, a counterstructure that organizes itself not around control but around balance. This principle does not emerge as an explicit opposition at first. It is embedded within the same cosmology, operating under the assumption that power, while necessary, must be tempered by something else, something that prevents total collapse into singularity. The emergence of New Genesis, as a counterpoint to Apocalypse, is not simply a narrative device. It is a structural necessity, a space in which the possibility of coexistence, of negotiated order, of shared existence can still be imagined. Where Apocalypse compresses, New Genesis expands. Where one imposes, the other accommodates. But this equilibrium is unstable, not because one side is weaker, but because the nature of the conflict is asymmetrical. New Genesis operates under the assumption that balance is possible, that opposing forces can coexist within a shared framework. That power can be distributed without being annihilated. Darkseid does not share this assumption. For him, balance is not a solution. It is a delay. The existence of a counterstructure does not represent an alternative. It represents an incompletion, a system that has not yet resolved itself into its most efficient form. And efficiency in this context is defined by the elimination of resistance, by the reduction of multiplicity into unity. Not unity as harmony, but unity as total control. This is where the concept of the anti-life equation begins to take shape, not as a mathematical formula, but as a symbolic condensation of Darkseid's orientation toward existence. The idea that life, in its multiplicity, its unpredictability, its capacity for divergence, is fundamentally flawed. That freedom is not a value, but a variable that introduces instability into the system. And that the ultimate solution is not to manage this instability, but to remove it. The anti-life equation does not promise destruction. It promises certainty, a state in which choice is no longer a factor, where thought aligns perfectly with command, where identity collapses into function. It is not the end of existence. It is the end of deviation, the end of anything that cannot be fully integrated into a singular structure of control. This is why Darkseid's pursuit of it is not framed as conquest in the traditional sense. It is framed as completion. The search for the equation is not about expanding territory. It is about locating the final mechanism through which all territory, all consciousness, all variance can be brought into alignment. Once obtained, the need for further action disappears. Because action itself presupposes resistance, and resistance, in Darkseid's framework, is a problem to be solved, not engaged. This orientation creates a fundamental incompatibility with any system that values autonomy. Not because autonomy is directly opposed, but because it is structurally irrelevant. From Darkseid's perspective, the existence of independent will is not an argument to be addressed. It is noise, something to be filtered out in the process of achieving clarity. This is what makes him distinct from other figures of domination. A tyrant seeks obedience, often because obedience reinforces identity. It confirms authority. It creates a feedback loop in which the ruler's position is continually validated by the submission of others. There is a psychological dimension to this, a need for recognition, even if distorted. Darkseid does not require recognition. He does not need to be seen, admired, or even feared in order to function. His orientation toward control is not dependent on perception. It is not sustained by belief. It exists independently of the responses it generates. Whether resisted or accepted, his trajectory remains unchanged. This absence of dependency alters the nature of the conflict, because it removes one of the primary leverage points through which power is typically contested. There is no appeal to ego, no possibility of negotiation based on mutual acknowledgement, no vulnerability that can be exploited through psychological means. The system he embodies does not contain openings. It contains only expansion. This is where the psychological dimension becomes more pronounced. For those who encounter Darkseid, the challenge is not simply external. It is not limited to the question of how to stop him, how to resist his forces, how to prevent the spread of his influence. It is also internal, a confrontation with a model of existence that does not validate the assumptions through which they understand themselves. If freedom is not fundamental, what is its basis? If identity can be reduced to function, what remains of individuality? If resistance does not alter the outcome, what is the meaning of opposition? These questions do not emerge as philosophical abstractions. They arise as consequences of proximity, as the natural result of existing within a system that does not recognize the values that define the observer. The closer one moves toward Darkseid, the less stable those values become. This is the deeper threat, not the destruction of worlds, although that occurs, not the subjugation of entire populations, although that is constant, but the erosion of the frameworks through which those events are interpreted, the gradual destabilization of meaning itself. Because once the possibility is introduced that evil is not contingent, that it does not require cause, justification, or explanation, then the entire structure of moral reasoning begins to shift. The distinction between action and condition collapses. The idea that something can be prevented by addressing its origins becomes less certain. Darkseid does not need an origin, or rather, his origin does not function as explanation. It functions as transition, a movement from participation within a system to embodiment of its most reductive principle. From being a figure within a hierarchy to becoming the hierarchy itself, stripped of all elements that do not directly contribute to its maintenance and expansion. This is why his presence is so difficult to contain within traditional narrative structures. He does not evolve in the way other characters do. He does not undergo transformation in response to events. He does not adapt in order to survive. His trajectory is not reactive. It is directional, a constant movement toward greater consolidation, greater reduction of variance, greater alignment of all things under a singular condition. And because of this, the conflict that forms around him is not symmetrical. It cannot be resolved through escalation, because escalation operates within a framework of exchange, action and counteraction, force and resistance. Darkseid exists outside this loop, not because he is beyond interaction, but because interaction does not alter his fundamental orientation. He does not need to win in order to remain. He only needs to continue. This is the foundation upon which the central tension is built. A system that assumes conflict can lead to resolution encountering a force for which resolution is irrelevant. A world that believes in the possibility of balance confronting a principle that recognizes only completion. And in the space between these assumptions, the phrase begins to solidify. Darkseid is, not as a statement of identity, but as a structural condition that cannot be removed from the system in which it appears, only confronted. The first encounters do not unfold as final confrontations. They never do. Instead, they emerge as controlled incursions, deliberate tests of the boundaries that define resistance. Darkseid does not rush toward domination in its total form, because totality is not something that needs to be asserted immediately. It is something that reveals itself gradually, through the failure of opposing structures to contain it. When Apocalypse extends its reach beyond its own territory, it does so with a precision that avoids spectacle. Armies are deployed, but not in overwhelming force. Agents are sent, but not as mere emissaries. Each movement is calibrated to probe, to measure the elasticity of the systems it encounters. Worlds that have never considered the possibility of absolute subjugation suddenly find themselves confronted with a form of power that does not negotiate its terms. The initial resistance is confident. It follows familiar patterns. Forces are gathered, alliances are formed, strategies are constructed based on the assumption that the conflict will behave according to known rules. There is an expectation that strength can be matched, that tactics can be countered, that time itself can be used as a resource. But the structure of the engagement begins to shift. Because Darkseid's approach does not rely on immediate victory. It relies on accumulation. Each incursion is not simply an attempt to conquer territory, but an experiment in erosion. Institutions are destabilized, not destroyed. Leaders are displaced, not eliminated. Systems of trust begin to fracture under pressure that is difficult to localize. The conflict does not announce itself as a war. It manifests as a series of adjustments. This is where the first layer of psychological dissonance emerges. Those who resist begin to recognize that the opposition they face does not behave as expected. It does not escalate in response to resistance. It does not retreat when confronted with strength. It persists, quietly, methodically, as if the outcome is not contingent on any single engagement. The battlefield expands beyond visible confrontation. Information becomes unstable. Alliances begin to falter under the weight of suspicion. The line between external threat and internal collapse becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. What appears as infiltration is not always the result of direct action. Sometimes it is the natural consequence of systems under strain, revealing weaknesses that were always present. Darkseid does not need to create every fracture. He needs only to apply pressure where fractures already exist. This is the mechanism through which his influence begins to take hold. Not through overwhelming force, but through alignment with the inherent instability of the systems he encounters. He does not impose disorder. He reveals the limits of order. And as this process unfolds, the nature of resistance begins to change. What was once a unified front becomes fragmented. Different factions interpret the threat in different ways. Some advocate for escalation, for direct confrontation, for the mobilization of all available resources. Others begin to question whether such confrontation is effective, whether the cost of resistance is sustainable. The conflict is no longer external. It begins to reorganize itself internally. This is the point at which Darkseid's presence becomes more than a physical threat. It becomes a conceptual pressure, a force that alters the way decisions are made, the way priorities are structured, the way identity itself is maintained within the system. Because once the possibility is introduced that the conflict cannot be resolved through conventional means, every action taken within that conflict becomes uncertain. Victory is no longer a clear objective. Survival becomes ambiguous. The distinction between holding ground and prolonging collapse becomes difficult to discern. This uncertainty does not weaken Darkseid's position. It strengthens it, because his strategy does not depend on clarity. It thrives in ambiguity. The less certain the opposition becomes about the nature of the conflict, the more effectively his influence can operate. Not through deception in the traditional sense, but through the amplification of existing contradictions. In this environment, the idea of the anti-life equation begins to shift from abstraction to presence. It is not yet fully realized, not yet fully understood, but its logic starts to appear in fragments, in moments where choice seems to narrow, where decisions feel less like expressions of will and more like responses to constraints that cannot be avoided. Individuals begin to act in ways that align with outcomes they do not consciously choose. Systems begin to reorganize themselves toward greater centralization, toward more rigid control, as if attempting to counter the instability they face. But in doing so, they begin to mirror the very structure they resist. The attempt to preserve order leads to the adoption of mechanisms that reduce autonomy. Control becomes a defense mechanism, and in that shift, the boundary between resistance and assimilation begins to blur. This is where the deeper transformation occurs, not in the visible expansion of apocalypse, but in the internal restructuring of the worlds it touches. The gradual movement toward a state in which the distinction between external domination and internal adaptation becomes indistinguishable. Darkseid does not need to occupy every territory. He needs those territories to begin occupying themselves according to his logic. The consequences of this process are not immediate. They unfold over time, often beneath the threshold of direct observation. But their effects accumulate. The systems that once defined themselves through autonomy, through variation, through the capacity to generate multiple outcomes begin to narrow. Options reduce. Paths converge. The space for divergence contracts. And within that contraction, the presence of Darkseid becomes more pronounced, even in places where he has never physically appeared. Because his influence is no longer tied to proximity. It is embedded within the structure of decisions, within the architecture of systems that have begun to reorganize themselves in response to pressure. This is the moment where the conflict takes on a different form. It is no longer a question of how to defeat an external force. It becomes a question of whether the internal structures that define resistance can survive the process of resisting. Whether the attempt to oppose domination inevitably leads to the adoption of its methods. Whether there is a way to remain distinct from the force being confronted. Or whether distinction itself is the first thing to collapse. As these questions begin to surface, the narrative space shifts again. The tension is no longer located solely in the actions of Darkseid or his forces. It resides within the systems that attempt to contain him, within the decisions that shape their response, within the gradual realization that the framework through which they understand the conflict may not be sufficient. The arena expands, the pressure increases, and the phrase that once seemed distant, abstract, almost symbolic, begins to take on a different weight. Not as a declaration imposed from outside, but as a condition that is being approached from within. Darkseid is, not as a future outcome, but as a trajectory that is already in motion. As the pressure continues to accumulate, the nature of the conflict undergoes a decisive shift. What began as a series of incursions, subtle and distributed, starts to consolidate into something more visible, more difficult to ignore. Not because Darkseid has changed his approach, but because the systems around him have reached a point where their internal adjustments can no longer remain contained. The fractures that once appeared isolated begin to align. Institutions that operated independently now respond in parallel, not through coordination, but through convergence. Policies tighten. Authority centralizes. The language of preservation becomes more rigid, more absolute. What was once framed as temporary measures begins to take on the character of permanence. And with that shift, the logic of apocalypse begins to surface within environments that once resisted it. This is not a direct transformation. It does not occur through declaration or recognition. It emerges through necessity, or what appears to be necessity. The need to stabilize, to maintain coherence, to prevent further erosion leads to decisions that compress the range of possible outcomes. Variation is treated as risk. Deviation becomes a liability. Control intensifies, but it is not experienced as domination. It is experienced as protection. This is the second layer of Darkseid's influence. The moment where the external threat begins to generate internal conditions that replicate its structure. Not because those conditions are imposed, but because they are selected, chosen as the most effective response to a situation that seems to allow no alternative. The boundary collapses further. Resistance begins to resemble the force it opposes. At this stage, direct confrontations do occur. Large-scale engagements, visible clashes between forces aligned with apocalypse and those attempting to contain its expansion. These battles are intense, often catastrophic, and they reinforce the perception that the conflict is still operating within a familiar framework. Action meets action, force meets force. But beneath this surface, the deeper transformation continues. Because even in these moments of confrontation, the outcomes do not resolve the underlying tension. Victories are achieved, territories are reclaimed, advances are halted. Yet none of these outcomes produce stability. They do not restore the previous state. They do not reverse the internal shifts that have already taken place. The system does not return to equilibrium. It continues to move. This is where the asymmetry becomes undeniable. Those who resist begin to recognize that their efforts, while effective in the immediate sense, do not alter the trajectory of the conflict. They delay. They redirect. They create temporary zones of stability. But they do not remove the underlying condition that generates instability in the first place. Darkseid does not need to win every battle. He needs the system to continue adapting in response to his presence. Because each adaptation brings it closer to alignment with his structure. This realization produces a new form of tension, not one based on fear of defeat, but on the recognition of inevitability. The sense that the conflict is not moving toward a resolution, but toward a convergence. That the distinction between opposing forces is gradually being eroded by the very process of opposition. In this environment, the anti-life equation becomes more than a conceptual endpoint. It becomes a horizon, a point toward which the system appears to be moving, regardless of the specific actions taken within it. Not because it has been activated, but because the conditions it represents are beginning to manifest organically. Choice narrows. Outcomes become predictable. The space for divergence continues to contract. Individuals within the system begin to experience this shift in more immediate ways. Decision-making changes. What once felt like agency begins to feel constrained, not by external force, but by the structure of available options. The range of possible actions diminishes, not through prohibition, but through the gradual elimination of viable alternatives. Freedom becomes abstract. Function becomes concrete. This is not enforced through visible mechanisms of control. It is reinforced through the logic of the system itself. Actions that align with stability are rewarded. Actions that introduce uncertainty are discouraged, often not through punishment, but through irrelevance. They simply fail to produce outcomes. And over time, this feedback loop reshapes behavior. Alignment becomes natural. Deviation becomes rare. The system begins to operate with a level of consistency that appears efficient, even desirable. Conflict reduces. Variation decreases. The unpredictability that once defined the environment gives way to a more ordered, more controlled state. But this order carries a different kind of weight. It is not expansive. It is compressive. The space in which identity can express itself begins to shrink. Not because identity is directly suppressed, but because the conditions that allow for its variation no longer exist. What remains is a narrower range of expression, one that aligns with the requirements of the system. This is the deeper consequence of Darkseid's influence. Not the imposition of control, but the creation of conditions in which control becomes the most viable form of existence. And as this process continues, the distinction between internal and external domination dissolves almost completely. The systems that once resisted now operate according to principles that mirror those of Apocalypse, even as they continue to define themselves in opposition. The contradiction becomes structural. They resist what they have begun to embody. This is where the psychological dimension reaches a critical point. Because those within the system begin to recognize the shift, even if they cannot fully articulate it. There is a sense that something fundamental has changed, that the terms of the conflict are no longer what they once were, that the actions taken in the name of preservation are producing outcomes that resemble the very condition they were meant to prevent. This recognition does not lead to immediate transformation. It leads to tension, an internal conflict between the need to continue resisting and the awareness that resistance may be contributing to the convergence. A hesitation that cannot fully express itself, because to stop acting would accelerate collapse, but to continue acting may reinforce the trajectory. This is the space in which Darkseid's presence becomes most pronounced. Not in the visible expansion of his forces, but in the structure of decisions made in response to him. In the narrowing of options, the compression of possibilities, the gradual movement toward a state in which the system becomes indistinguishable from the force it opposes. The arena has changed. It is no longer defined by territory. It is defined by alignment. And within this alignment, the phrase returns not as an external imposition, but as an internal realization. Darkseid is, not as a distant threat, but as a condition that has begun to take shape within the very structures that sought to resist it. The final phase of the conflict does not arrive as a climax in the traditional sense. There is no singular event that marks its culmination, no decisive confrontation that clarifies the outcome. Instead, it emerges as a saturation point, a moment in which the accumulated pressures, adjustments, and internal transformations reach a density that can no longer be distributed across the system. Everything converges. The structures that once operated with relative autonomy now move in synchronization, not through coordination, but through inevitability. Decisions that once required deliberation now unfold almost automatically, as if the system itself has begun to anticipate its own outcomes. The space between cause and effect contracts. Action becomes immediate, predictable, aligned. This is not stability. It is compression. At this stage, Darkseid's physical presence becomes almost secondary. His appearances, when they occur, do not introduce new dynamics. They confirm existing ones. The battlefield, once defined by movement and opposition, has transformed into a fixed architecture. A landscape in which every position is already accounted for, every resistance already anticipated, every outcome already integrated into the structure. The arena no longer expands. It closes. This is where the full weight of the anti-life equation begins to manifest, not as a discrete event, but as a condition that has been assembled piece by piece. The equation does not need to be activated in a singular moment, because its logic has already permeated the system. The reduction of variance, the elimination of unpredictability, the alignment of thought and function have all been gradually realized. Choice becomes residual. It exists, but it no longer alters the trajectory. This is the critical threshold, because it marks the point at which the distinction between resistance and participation collapses entirely. Actions taken in opposition to Darkseid no longer produce divergent outcomes. They are absorbed into the system, contributing to its coherence rather than disrupting it. The feedback loop is complete. Resistance stabilizes domination. This realization does not arrive uniformly. It emerges in fragments, in moments of recognition that are often suppressed or redirected. Those who perceive it most clearly find themselves in a position that is difficult to sustain. To act is to reinforce. To abstain is to concede. The binary that once structured the conflict dissolves into a continuum where every position is already integrated. There is no outside. This is the condition that Darkseid represents in its most complete form. Not simply control over territory, over bodies, over institutions, but control over the framework through which opposition itself is defined. A state in which the system no longer produces genuine alternatives, only variations of alignment. The psychological impact of this condition is profound. Identity begins to destabilize, not because it is directly attacked, but because the structures that support its differentiation have eroded. The sense of self, once defined in relation to choices, to actions that could alter outcomes, finds itself operating within a field where those distinctions no longer carry weight. The individual becomes functional, defined by role, by position within the system, by the contribution they make to its ongoing coherence. Expression narrows, not through prohibition, but through irrelevance. Actions that do not align with the system simply fail to propagate. They do not generate consequences. They dissipate, silently. This silence is not absence. It is absorption. At the level of collective structures, the transformation is even more pronounced. The systems that once mediated between individual agency and collective order have reconfigured themselves entirely. Governance, communication, coordination all operate under a unified logic that prioritizes stability above all else. Variance is not suppressed because it is dangerous. It is suppressed because it is unnecessary. The system has no use for it. This is where the symbolic architecture of Apocalypse reveals itself as more than a localized environment. Its principles have extended outward, not through expansion, but through replication. The compressive gravity that defines its terrain now operates across the entire field, not as a visible force, but as a condition that shapes every interaction. Every structure becomes a reflection. Every decision becomes a reinforcement. The distinction between center and periphery dissolves, because the same logic applies everywhere. There is no edge to this system, no boundary beyond which its influence does not extend. Not because it has physically occupied all space, but because its principles have become the most efficient way for systems to operate under pressure. This is the final consolidation. Darkseid no longer needs to act. He is the system, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a structural one. The alignment between his orientation and the functioning of the environment is complete. The difference between his will and the behavior of the system has collapsed. What the system does is what he is. And what he is does not require action. It requires continuation. This is why the idea of defeat becomes irrelevant at this stage. There is no external force to remove, no central node to disrupt. The condition is distributed, embedded in every layer of the structure. To dismantle it would require the reintroduction of variance, of unpredictability, of divergence. But those capacities have been systematically reduced. Not eliminated entirely, but rendered inert. This is where the remaining tension resides. In the fragments that have not fully aligned, in the residual spaces where unpredictability still flickers, where actions still produce unexpected outcomes, where identity still retains a degree of differentiation. These spaces are small, isolated, often unstable, but they exist. And their existence introduces a final question, not about victory, not about resistance in its traditional form, but about whether these fragments can generate enough divergence to disrupt the coherence of the system, whether the reintroduction of unpredictability can create fractures that cannot be absorbed, whether there is a threshold beyond which the system cannot maintain its alignment. This is not a question that the system itself can answer, because the system is designed to resolve questions into stability. It can only be answered through action that does not conform to the logic of the system, action that does not seek to produce predictable outcomes, that does not align with the feedback loops that reinforce coherence, action that reintroduces uncertainty. But such action is difficult to sustain, because it does not guarantee success. It does not even guarantee visibility. It operates at the edge of the system, in spaces where consequences are not clearly defined, where outcomes cannot be anticipated. It requires a form of engagement that does not rely on control, that does not seek to dominate, that does not attempt to stabilize. It requires divergence. This is the final tension, not between opposing forces, but between two modes of existence. One that seeks alignment, consolidation, predictability, and one that maintains the capacity for deviation, for unpredictability, for the emergence of outcomes that cannot be fully integrated. Darkseid embodies the first. The fragments that remain embody the second, and the conflict between them does not resolve. It persists, not as a battle, but as a condition that continues to unfold within a system that has already moved closer to one pole than the other. The phrase remains, unchanged. Darkseid is, not as a conclusion, but as the structure within which all remaining tension must now operate. Once the conflict reaches this level of saturation, it ceases to belong exclusively to the narrative that produced it. It begins to migrate, not as a story being retold, but as a structure being recognized. The figure of Darkseid moves beyond the boundaries of his fictional universe and enters the broader field of cultural perception, where characters are no longer confined to their original contexts, but function as symbols through which deeper tensions can be observed. This is where his significance becomes most apparent, not in the scale of his power, which is immense, nor in the complexity of his design, which is deliberately minimal, but in the way he reorganizes the way evil itself is perceived. Prior to this, evil in popular imagination often retains a human dimension. It is tied to intention, to motivation, to deviation from a norm that remains fundamentally intact. Even when amplified to cosmic proportions, it still operates within a framework that assumes contingency. Darkseid removes this assumption. He introduces a model of evil that does not depend on context, that does not require justification, that does not seek validation through narrative explanation. In doing so, he shifts the cultural conversation away from the question of why evil occurs and toward the question of what it means for evil to exist as a condition. This shift is subtle, but its implications are extensive, because it alters the relationship between audience and narrative. Viewers are no longer positioned to understand, to empathize, or even to fully comprehend the antagonist. Instead, they are confronted with a presence that resists interpretation, a force that does not reveal itself through dialogue, through internal conflict, or through transformation. Darkseid does not evolve, and in a narrative landscape that often prioritizes growth, redemption, or psychological depth, this absence of evolution becomes its own form of presence. It creates a void where expectation once resided, a space where the audience cannot rely on familiar patterns to orient themselves. This is where discomfort emerges, not from what Darkseid does, but from what he refuses to do. He does not explain himself. He does not justify his actions. He does not present a version of himself that can be reconciled with human frameworks of meaning. And because of this, he cannot be assimilated into the kinds of narratives that typically neutralize antagonism through understanding. He remains external, and yet, paradoxically, he becomes internal. because the absence of explanation forces the observer to confront the possibility that not all forces can be integrated into a coherent system of meaning, that there are conditions that exist outside the interpretive frameworks that culture relies on to stabilize perception. This is where Darkseid begins to function not just as a character, but as a symbolic pressure, a weight, one that presses against the boundaries of comprehension, revealing the limits of the systems used to interpret reality. This pressure extends into the broader cultural field in ways that are not always immediately visible. Narratives that attempt to grapple with systemic control, with the erosion of autonomy, with the convergence of power and structure begin to echo the logic that Darkseid embodies. Not through direct reference, but through structural similarity, the idea that systems can become self-reinforcing. That control can emerge not only through force, but through alignment. That individuals can participate in their own subjugation without recognizing it as such. These themes begin to appear with greater frequency, reflecting a shift in the collective imagination toward a more complex understanding of power. Darkseid becomes a lens through which these dynamics can be observed, not because he introduces them, but because he condenses them. He takes diffuse anxieties, fragmented perceptions, and organizes them into a singular figure that embodies their most distilled form. In doing so, he provides a focal point for a set of concerns that might otherwise remain abstract. This is the function of myth in its contemporary form, not to explain the world, but to reveal its underlying tensions. And Darkseid operates within this space with a level of clarity that is difficult to replicate. He does not dilute the concepts he represents. He does not soften their implications. He presents them in their most direct form, without mediation. This directness has consequences. It resists commodification in the traditional sense. While many antagonists can be reinterpreted, recontextualized, even rehabilitated to fit changing cultural norms, Darkseid remains largely unchanged. Attempts to humanize him tend to reduce his symbolic potency. Attempts to contextualize him within a moral framework tend to obscure the very condition he represents. He does not adapt easily, and this resistance to adaptation reinforces his position within the cultural landscape. He becomes a fixed point, a reference that does not shift in response to changing narratives, but instead provides a constant against which those narratives can be measured. This constancy is rare. In a media environment characterized by rapid transformation, by the continual reinvention of characters to align with evolving audience expectations, the persistence of a figure that does not change becomes significant. It suggests that there are certain symbolic structures that retain their relevance not through flexibility, but through stability. Darkseid embodies one of these structures. The idea that power, when fully realized, does not need to justify itself. That control, when fully integrated, does not need to assert itself through visible mechanisms. That domination, at its most complete, is not experienced as an external imposition, but as an internal condition. These ideas resonate beyond the confines of fiction. They intersect with broader cultural concerns about systems that operate beyond individual control, about structures that shape behavior in ways that are not always visible, about the difficulty of identifying points of resistance within environments that appear self-organizing. In this context, Darkseid becomes more than a representation of evil. He becomes a representation of inevitability, not in the sense that outcomes are predetermined, but in the sense that certain structural dynamics, once set in motion, tend to reinforce themselves, that the accumulation of power leads to greater consolidation, that systems under pressure tend to reduce variance in order to maintain stability. These are not abstract concepts. They are observable patterns, and the presence of Darkseid within the cultural imagination provides a framework through which these patterns can be recognized, even if only implicitly. He does not explain them. He reflects them, He gives them form without offering resolution. This is why the phrase that defines him carries such weight. Darkseid is. It functions as a condensation of the entire symbolic structure he represents. A statement that resists expansion, that does not invite elaboration, that refuses to be integrated into a narrative of change or resolution. It asserts presence without context, and in doing so, it disrupts the expectation that narratives must move toward closure. Because if Darkseid is, then the condition he represents is not something that can be concluded. It cannot be resolved through a final act, a decisive victory, a restoration of balance. It remains persistent. This persistence is what allows the conflict to extend beyond its original narrative. It continues to operate within the imagination, within the frameworks through which power, control, and resistance are understood. It becomes a reference point for thinking about systems that do not offer clear points of intervention. And this is where its cultural impact becomes most pronounced. Not in the popularity of the character, not in the frequency of his appearances, but in the way he alters the structure of perception. The way he introduces a form of tension that does not resolve, that does not dissipate, that continues to exert pressure on the frameworks used to interpret conflict. Darkseid does not provide answers. He removes them. And in that removal, he creates a space in which new forms of understanding must emerge, not as solutions, but as adaptations to a condition that does not change. This is his function, not as a villain, but as a structural presence within the cultural imagination, one that does not need to act in order to shape the way reality is perceived. What remains after such a conflict is not resolution. It is sediment, layers of structural change that no longer appear as change, but as baseline. The systems that endured the pressure do not return to what they were, because there is no longer a reference point that feels stable enough to justify a return. What once defined normality has been displaced, not dramatically, but irreversibly. This is the first mark of Darkseid's legacy. Not destruction, although destruction occurs. Not conquest, although conquest is visible. But the quiet redefinition of what is considered natural within a system. The gradual normalization of compression, of alignment, of reduced variance. Conditions that would once have been recognized as external impositions now operate as internal expectations. The system learns, but it learns in a specific direction. It learns how to stabilize under pressure by reducing unpredictability. It learns how to maintain coherence by narrowing the range of acceptable outcomes. It learns how to function efficiently within constraints that it did not originally choose, but has now incorporated. This learning is not neutral. It carries forward the logic of the force that initiated the pressure. And this is where the legacy of Darkseid becomes difficult to isolate, because it does not reside in a singular event or a defined outcome. It resides in the way systems continue to operate after his direct influence has receded, in the persistence of structures that mirror his orientation, even in the absence of his presence. The world does not forget him. It reorganizes around the possibility of him. This is the deeper aftermath, a shift from reacting to a specific threat toward internalizing the conditions that make that threat possible. Systems begin to anticipate pressure, to preempt instability, to configure themselves in ways that reduce the likelihood of disruption. But in doing so, they also reduce the space for divergence. They become resilient and less flexible. This trade-off is rarely acknowledged explicitly, but it shapes the trajectory of the system over time. The capacity to adapt becomes tied to the ability to maintain control. The capacity to evolve becomes constrained by the need to preserve stability. Variation is tolerated only insofar as it does not threaten coherence. This is how the influence persists, not as domination, but as orientation, a direction in which systems tend to move when faced with uncertainty, a set of responses that become habitual, even in the absence of the original conditions that produced them. The pressure field remains, not as an active force, but as a memory embedded in structure. This memory alters perception. Future conflicts are interpreted differently. Threats are identified earlier. Responses are more immediate, more controlled. The margin for experimentation narrows. The willingness to allow systems to remain open, to risk instability in order to preserve variation, decreases. Security becomes central, and with it, the mechanisms that ensure it. This is where the legacy of Darkseid intersects with identity. Not at the level of individual psychology alone, but at the level of collective self-understanding. Systems begin to define themselves not only by what they are, but by what they must prevent. The possibility of total domination becomes a reference point against which all decisions are measured. This creates a paradox. In attempting to avoid a condition of absolute control, systems adopt structures that move them closer to it, not because they desire it, but because it appears to be the most effective way to ensure survival. The logic that once belonged to an external force becomes internalized as a protective mechanism. The boundary dissolves, and with it, the clarity that once defined opposition. This is why the question of defeat never fully resolves. Not because Darkseid cannot be opposed, but because the conditions that allow for his reemergence are never fully removed. They remain embedded in the structures that define order, control, and stability. They persist as latent possibilities, as trajectories that can be activated under sufficient pressure. Darkseid does not need to return. He needs only for the conditions that reflect him to remain viable. This is the enduring tension, not between presence and absence, but between activation and dormancy, between systems that operate under the assumption of openness and those that move toward closure, between the maintenance of variance and the consolidation of control. The aftermath does not eliminate this tension. It stabilizes it. It creates a new equilibrium in which both tendencies coexist, not as balanced opposites, but as competing directions within the same structure. Systems oscillate between them, sometimes expanding, sometimes contracting, always carrying the imprint of the conflict that reshaped them. This oscillation becomes the new baseline, and within it, the figure of Darkseid remains as a constant reference, not as an active agent, but as a structural possibility that continues to inform how systems interpret themselves. His presence is no longer required to produce his effects. They have been integrated. This is what it means for evil to exist as a condition, not as a force that must be continually asserted, but as a state that can be realized under certain configurations. A pattern that can emerge when systems prioritize alignment over divergence, control over variation, stability over openness. Darkseid embodies this pattern in its most complete form. And because of this, his legacy is not confined to the narrative in which he appears. It extends into the frameworks through which narratives themselves are constructed, into the expectations that audiences bring to stories, into the ways in which conflict is understood, into the assumptions that shape the interpretation of power. He alters the grammar of conflict, not by introducing new elements, but by removing the expectation of resolution, by demonstrating that some structures do not move toward closure, that some conditions do not dissipate, that some tensions remain embedded within the systems that produce them. This is why the phrase endures. Darkseid is. It does not conclude the narrative. It defines its horizon. A limit that cannot be crossed, only approached. A condition that does not end, only shifts in intensity. A presence that does not require action to remain, because it is already embedded in the structures that define existence within the narrative. And in that persistence, the conflict finds its final form. Not as a story that reaches an ending, but as a system that continues to operate.